If we could all take our seats, please. Okay, I'd like to now introduce you to Chris. Chris is a self-taught developer. Is it 9 years experience?
Yeah,
9 years experience with WordPress. Chris this evening is going to be talking to us about WordPress or Laravel, or why not both. So please give Chris a big round of applause.
Okay, so hi everyone. I did also, as Tim also had, I've also given this talk previously at WordCamp. So many of you may have already heard it, but this is a much more condensed version. But I hope a lot of you guys, it might be quite new to you also. So first of all, I'm sure we both know that we all know what Laravel is. Just show of hands, who here has actually used Laravel? Have you used it in combination with WordPress at any point? No? Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of ways how people are using it in very interesting ways. Yeah, there's a lot of themes that are built on Laravel or using the Laravel engine and so on. But in a lot of projects, I've actually built applications in Laravel and used WordPress as just a headless CMS for that. You may ask, well, why do that? Why not use JavaScript or React or so on? There's a few reasons for that I'll go through. So, quick introduction for those who may not have used it before. It's first released in 2011 under the MIT license, open source software. It's created by Taylor Otwell. He actually first created this. It's based on the similar Symfony framework, which is also a PHP development framework, which is used. It's slightly older, but it's Laravel is based on that, so you find a lot of cross-compatibility between the two. But as mentioned in the introduction, WordPress can be used to set up a headless or decoupled CMS with that. Decoupled would be more if you're probably using it with Laravel and Vue on top of that. But in this case, I'm going to focus more on just the headless. So if we look at the strengths of using both, because every time we get a new project, we always have to decide or at least I always take the approach of what's the best tool for this particular job. In terms of what the client scope is, what's the best thing to use for that? Now, WordPress has its particular strengths, but I think we can all be honest, but there are some web applications and some use cases that WordPress is not the best out there for. And there's a lot of things that likewise Laravel may not be the best for. But I feel like you can actually combine the two in an application to use both their strengths. So, for example, WordPress, generally very good with e-commerce through WooCommerce and like content-based sites. Laravel works very well with more web application framework as opposed to just a plain website. So, if we look at Laravel, the strengths, the MVC architecture, the model view controller way of doing things, having the code split into very specific modules that are pieced together to make the application. Many built-in functions, built-in database migration, which I think makes it particularly work well with WordPress. So you can build the database migrations into your application. So when you're moving it between environments, you just run that from your command line and you can copy all your data across in that way. It's built for rapid development. It's extremely rapid development. Laravel is the structure of the framework is in such a way. The structure of the framework is in such a way where you can build an application very rapidly, and a quite sophisticated application. It's relatively secure. Obviously, this does depend on who's using it and what the code on there is, but generally it's much more secure. It has the way it stores things in the database, for example. I mean, that's another talk in itself, but I won't go into that. Blade templating, so the code is split into very small your templates are in small individual elements, or you can split them up in that way, or you can have them in large templates. That's one of its strengths. Easy unit testing. PHP unit is built in as a vendor. And Artisan command line interface. So, for example, the migration, that is through the Artisan command line. WordPress, we all know the strengths of that. We'll go through intuiting, built-in REST API, which will be useful in this example. A very large community, developers, content people, highly extendable, easily adapts to new needs, many features built in. Works on most server setups and many themes and plugins. Now, the themes and plugins, obviously the strengths and weakness, that depends on the quality that's there, but really you could see it as a strength. I think by combining the two, you actually, this is if you're taking the headless approach, you will get actually all of the strengths, potentially, except for possibly the many themes and plugins, because of course that functionality will come more from your Laravel application, whereas WordPress will be used as the headless CMS just for the content. So I did mention some use cases. I've came across a few in my time, and I've used this approach on several projects. I mean, one big change, which is can be a security issue, or just in terms of avoiding unintentional breaking of layout and so on. If you want to limit the changes that can affect the front end to only content updates. So if you want your client to only be able to actually affect the front end in terms of blogs or pages that are added, then this might be a good approach, particularly if it's a very complex site. And you could use it for rapid and clean development, as I mentioned. I won't go much more into that part. You can have more flexibility in your WordPress development. When we're developing for WordPress, we find there's a very sort of prescribed way of doing certain things, and it can be very restrictive, or you need to do a lot around that to actually make it work to your project in some cases. Whereas if you take this approach, you can actually have much more flexibility, and you can develop the application much more rapidly, and you cut out a lot of the time that you're just adapting to a particular theme or adapting your plugins together and so on. And yeah, as mentioned, if you want to use it only for creating content, not displaying it. So if you want to remove that connect between the CMS and the front end for performance reasons, that's a good approach. This last section is, in many of the use cases I've used this in production, that is essentially the main reason. So if you have a blog or news section on our site where it would be a very minor feature, so suppose you had a site which was a social networking site that was built for a client. May not be the best thing to build on WordPress because of the specific use case of this particular project. But the client wants a blog on that site, and they also want to be able to add easily to that site, and perhaps they know WordPress already. So you could use this approach to actually have headless WordPress just for a blog section on a larger application. So it's the traditional or coupled approach with CMS, standard for WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, most CMS systems out there. So that's where the front end is tightly linked to the back end. That's default with WordPress. It's default with virtually any CMS. I don't know of any that have it as not a default. Disadvantages, content types and delivery channels often limited without further customization. You know, if you need custom post types in WordPress, for example, or in Drupal, you have to actually build those, which is more time, obviously, and can add more time to a project. Limited developing framework, more time need for customizations. Depending on the CMS or the framework around it, it's not always developer friendly, particularly when you want to build quite complex applications. It can be a huge drain on server resources. Again, this does depend on the hosting that's in place, but yeah, there are many cases where, particularly with very large sites, it starts to show its bloat when it gets to a certain size. And the code can, and adding on to that, the code can become messy extremely quickly. You can find if you're adding to a WordPress site and adding customizations as a developer because a client need or so on over time, you realize fairly, almost when it's too late sometimes, that it's got to the code base has got to such a size that it's difficult to maintain. And this is where having the Laravel system of the code being in small modules and in classes, it helps it be much easier to maintain. And the very real chance the client or editor breaking the site through, possibly an addition through a plugin in the content, that's something we do find in WordPress. I'm sure everyone here has probably came across that in some of the sites you may have worked on. A client may unintentionally add something to a site, or may unintentionally add some HTML markup, and it will break because of some fault in a plugin somewhere. But by having this disconnect between the CMS and the front end, and having Laravel only get the information from the database, you can remove a lot of this. Right. So, would you go with headless or decoupled? Now, that depends really on what you're looking to do, and how much you want the CMS system to actually give. So if you want the CMS to be, if you want the content to be pre-processed and the CSS to be pre-processed and the styling, then you would probably go with decoupled. Whereas if you're just using the CMS as a data repository, then you would probably go with the headless approach. But again, this depends on your use case. It's decoupled. That's back end, goes to an API, goes to a front end, and then the channels. So that's in this front end area, that's where it's actually pre-processed. So the CSS is pre-processed and so on. Something like a static site generator would probably do it in this way. Whereas headless, there's no front end pre-processing. That's all done at the channel stage. So you just have an API or database connection just feeding the data to this third party. And yeah, so depending on your use case, one or the other may be better. And that's the approach I'll briefly focus on. So there's two approaches. You can go either the API route or a database. If you've got it on if you have WordPress on the same server, you may go with the database approach or the API-based approach. Now, I'm not going to say one or the other is better, and there probably are better ways of doing it. But it's just as a proof of concept. I'll show this. I think I've already gone to this. Right. Now, there are some important points to consider if you're going to do this. So, first of all, you would need, if any of you are familiar with the home URL versus site URL fields in WordPress, that's what would be important to consider here. So, the home URL would be in your database. You'll set that as actually the directory where your site is, where the WordPress install is located. So this is if you're having it on the same server. Whereas public URL would be set to where it's actually viewed by the public. You would need routing correctly set up in this routes/web.php file. Now that's a file within Laravel that sets up your routing. You can set it up dynamically, and through there, that's where it's all set. So it's the equivalent of what would be the permalink rules in WordPress. And optional, but I always do this, create Laravel helper functions or classes. So you create your own custom set of classes and functions that you can then reuse throughout your project. And the example I'll give is actually where you can duplicate a lot of the built-in WordPress functions into your Laravel application. Implemented via the REST API. So a few advantages: does not require Laravel and the WordPress tables to be in the same database. Doesn't even need to be on the same server. It can be in separate environments. And it's fairly future-proof and cross-compatible, so it could be used. You're less likely to come across compatibility issues when using it across other channels also. And very easily implemented. Now, if you're going to do it through the database query, So you access the database, the WordPress database, directly through WordPress's directly through Laravel's built-in database functions. So like DB, colon table, and so on. Now, one advantage is this does mean there's no need to add additional customizations or plugins to access the other elements in the REST API. So as many of you will know, the WordPress REST API, it has a lot in there, but there's certain things that you might want to fetch that are not by default in there. So you would need to either create your own plugin or use another third-party solution to actually fetch that data. And one thing I touched on earlier, migration of WordPress database tables is much easier with the PHP artisan migrate command. So you can actually create migration instructions for your WordPress tables. So then when you're moving it from dev to production, you don't need to separately move your database. You can just take it from, create a migration file, which will then create that same content elsewhere. And as mentioned, it's also well suited for Laravel applications where there's also Laravel data in your database. So if your Laravel application has its own database tables that you're calling from, this might be a good approach also to use. There's going to be 10 simple steps. I'm going to go through them very quickly because of time. There's 5 things you would need to be fairly comfortable with to do this. Be at least comfortable with SSH command line, or comfortable enough to at least look it up and then do it. Have Composer installed on your server. So Composer, the PHP dependency management system. Know how to install WordPress from scratch. So this isn't something you could do with a one-click install through your host. It's something you would need to install WordPress from scratch on your server. And be confident in editing the WP config file, because you will need to, especially when setting the site URL and home URL for your site. Be confident in developing Laravel applications. Now, you don't need to be an expert. You just need to at least have some comfort in building for Laravel, or at least some good knowledge of object-oriented PHP. You can learn it on the fly, but it does save a lot of time and headache if you read up a bit about it before. So first, with something similar to this, you install Laravel in, well, wherever really, but for this example, we say in a htdocs, an empty htdocs or public HTML folder. So this is in Linux, but it's similar in most operating systems. So Composer, create project, prefer this, Laravel, and because we're installing actual core Laravel, we use that. Other examples are Lumen, which is a very lightweight version of Laravel. And there's other similar versions like LaraAdmin, which is a CMS. But if you're installing Laravel, the core application, you use that, and then the directory that you're installing it to. Set your database credentials in Laravel's .env and database.php file. It's actually a /config/database.php. So that'll be at the root of the project. So you set your database credentials in the .env and in database.php. The very good thing about database.php is you can actually also set it for multiple database types. So there's MariaDB, SQLite, and MongoDB in there also. So you can set it for multiple types of database. Remove public from the default homepage URL. So when those of you guys who've worked with Laravel, if you're working locally, you'd already know this, but by default, when you're viewing it, you have to put like the path to the root and then public until you run a artisan serve command. So a way around this, you can move htaccess from public folder to the root and rename server.php to index.php. So you're essentially rerouting it, so that's actually the root of the project rather than /public. Install WordPress in a subdirectory. Here I'll say example /WP. If you have WordPress data to import into the database, I'll do it at this point. Otherwise, just go through the setup of WordPress as usual. So go to / the directory where you've set it up and set it up as usual. Create some blade templates. So these are the templates I mentioned where they are, you can have them of any size. You can have them in very small chunks of code that you piece together, and you can have them in a very large template files. But that's essentially what they are. If you think of it like building a WordPress theme, it's like the template files for your WordPress theme, essentially. So it's the equivalent of index.php, page.php, and single dot. But the structure of it, it's kind of up to you. I mean, you can separate it into directories within the resources views directory, or you can just have it as just individual files. It depends on how complex your project is and down to preference. But yeah, here for example, I just have a very basic blade template in a layouts folder, so default.blade, and it just yields content, includes a sidebar, so that would be another blade template it's including, and it's also including a footer, which is another one. Yeah, so, and here this is like a page, so it's using that layout and then fetching the content and includes another blade from there. And if you were to create a blade template for post and blog archive templates, this is one very crude example of how you might do it. This is not code in production, it's just an example of what you might do. So you have the database connection here. So that's something I really like about Laravel and what makes things very quick. So if you're doing a database query, you can add all these multiple where clauses, and it essentially filters down the query in a very quick way. And then you can use either first, which fetches just one result, or get, which fetches all of them. And in get, you can put a number. So, and here's an example of a similar thing, but using the REST API to do that. And yep, this is for a blog archive, so just an example. And this is an example of the blog feed again. Yep. So here you get for each one of the posts is rendered. And in the WP config file, as I mentioned, you would set your WP home and WP site URL. So in this example, I put the WP at /CMS. And if I was not going to serve WordPress to the whole site, just to a section, like maybe just to a blog section, then I just put like /blog. So then I have /blog, that's the site URL for WordPress. And in the routes.php file that I mentioned in Laravel, I would make references to /blog and then dynamically route through all of the post slug values. And set the permalink structure in your permalinks settings. So something similar to this, if you wanted to, you could have it much more dynamic. You could add categories and so on, but you would also need to match this in your routes web.php file. And then you just create new posts through WordPress Post Editor. And as I mentioned, the last step, you'll actually route those through your routes.php file. So, for example, here we're getting the posts. And for each of those, we push it to an array. And that array we loop through here. And that is essentially telling Laravel that whenever something fits that rule, then we serve the article template. And in there's logic to actually pull that specific article. Now I did mention there was I use a lot of custom functions when I'm doing this. So here's examples of where here's 3 examples of custom functions I've built to much more quickly get WordPress post content in Laravel. So a WP post query, get WP post, or get WP page. So yeah, here's just some examples of where you could build a helper file to use those functions out your project. Again, you could store that anywhere, but you would need to in your composer.json file just for it. There are a lot of other frameworks and a lot of other systems being used for headless WordPress. Laravel is not the... there's a lot of stuff being done with Gatsby and React in general. I've heard of some stuff being done with Vue, and you know, there's no reason you cannot also do this on Symfony, Cake, or even Angular. But for my specific projects, I choose Laravel because it depends. I suppose that's where I'm coming from as a PHP developer. I like that server-side language, but you also, it depends on what the project is most fitted for. In my experience, I feel like the projects I've been working with, because they're quite, if they have quite tight deadlines, Laravel is often the best to get a very healthy and quick code base up that's easily extendable and fits in well with WordPress. So thank you and happy coding.
Chris, thank you very much. We do have some time for a couple of quick questions, if we have any at all. Yes.
I've got a question about post meta in WordPress.
Sure.
And get really messy and lots of different rows for the same main WP post row. How do you handle that in Laravel with Eloquent?
Right. So there's I have come across this problem, and the way, essentially through trial and error, to create another function to fetch the post data for that specific post ID. So I created a function that would get the post ID itself, and then through that you fetch all of the post meta as a array and put it through.
Are you using models for your posts as well? Post types, custom post types?
Not in all projects. In some we have. It depends on the again on the complexity and the need for the project. But in some we definitely have.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah, sure.
If I can. You talked about migration using the Laravel migration for WordPress databases.
Yes.
But I thought that when you upgrade WordPress through the WordPress system, it has its own kind of like routine that updates the database. How do you keep those two in sync then?
Honestly, that would depend on the setup you're using. It's not been something we've had to use fairly often, because in the servers we've had, we often, our DevOps guys make sure that's all synced.
Okay.
But there are cases where between in version control, we've wanted to have dummy data in place, so it's helped for those situations, for example. Okay.
Excellent, great questions. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
What was the decision that went into you creating your own functions versus using a library to do that?
I'll say I think at the time we couldn't find any library for Laravel or component that would actually do that directly, or at least as quickly as we could spring it up ourselves. So essentially, it was just down to the need for the project, and we found it worked very well, so kept using it. Yeah.
Excellent. Any more questions? So, Chris, you talked a lot about the positives of this.
Yeah.
You mentioned the potential downfalls, plugins, themes. Any other big downfalls, negatives? Anything that you would...
Yeah, I would say potential downfalls would be if you. It depends on what you want to get out of it. So, if you're just using WordPress as a content repository, it works fairly well. But if you also want to be able to pull in, say, for example, CSS or themes as they are in a typical WordPress site and use them in Laravel, you can do that. But if you're going with a decoupled, it's probably more work than it's worth. I would say you're probably more suitable going with maybe Gatsby or a static site builder for that.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Chris, thank you very much. A big round of applause for Chris. Okay, let me just get the. Okay, we are pretty much at a close. Just a couple of things I want to quickly run through before we disappear out. And excellent, nothing's working. Okay, sorry about that. First of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to both our speakers this evening. They've given time this evening to both travel. Tim, how far were you on the train to get here this afternoon? Nine o'clock this morning, got here about 3 o'clock. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate both of you giving your time to be able to do this evening. If you do have any, if you are considering giving a talk, we would love to hear from you. Anything that you feel that you might want to share with the community, we'd love to hear about it. To be honest, no talk is silly. No talk is not. Sorry. There is no really. It's a bit like there's no silly question. There's no silly talk really. There's stuff in here that each and every one of us knows that other people in this room don't know, and for you to be able to come up here and stand and share that knowledge, fantastic. So if you are thinking about giving a talk, then we would love to hear from you. Please do reach out to us. We can be contacted through the website, through Twitter, various channels. I just want to say a very, very quick thank you to our sponsors, Green Geek SiteGround, WP Engine, Plesk, Weglot and Yoti for enabling this evening. We do have an opportunity for you to provide feedback. We are always looking to develop and evolve these events around your feedback. So whether you do it through the website at wpldn.uk/feedback or whether you do it to us in person, both positive and negative, we want to hear it because we want to ensure that we're continually evolving and developing these events for you, the community. So our next event will be the 27th of June. So we are the last Thursday of every month. It'd be great to see you if you can come and join us again. Just one final announcement. I just want to say a huge thank you to Yoti. I don't think Mara's in the room at the moment, but the team behind Yoti, the building that we're in at the moment, have been absolutely fantastic in supporting us, in supporting WP&LDN, giving us a home. I think you'll all agree it's a fantastic space. We've got the table tennis, we've got table football, we've got it's just a lovely space to be. But this is the last time we are in this event. In this venue, sorry. We are moving to Cloudflare. So some of you may remember we were in Cloudflare about a year ago, and they have just renovated another building, another warehouse that we are moving to. So it would be great if you could come and join us. It's a larger space. There's lots of things that we're going to be doing to encourage the development and the growth of this event. We want to see this group twice the size. We want to see a lot more of us, the community, coming together for these great events. So please do join us on 27th of June at the Cloudflare offices, based literally behind the London Eye, so not too far from here. We are now going to head round to the cross keys for a social. So if you can join us, if you don't know where the cross keys are, grab somebody who looks like they're heading in the right sort of direction. We'll head over there, just continue the conversations, really. Continue the networking and the relationships. It would be good to see you all there if you can join us. I would, as I say, I'd just like to say a big, big, big thank you to both Gary for everything that he's done over the years, and to Yoti for everything that they've done for us in the last year here. So I think both deserve a huge round of applause. Just been reminded, if you put your hand up earlier and you said you're going to WordCamp Europe, just before we all disperse, do you want to just kind of gather and make yourselves known? So there are several of us that are going to be travelling to WordCamp Europe that are travelling on our own. And it would be great just to be able to connect with a few other people, whether we end up on the same flights, whether we end up in the same hotels. It would just be good to put a face to the name to the people that we're travelling with. So if you did stick your hand up, would you want to just gather over there a little bit before we go? Other than that, thank you all very much. Really appreciate you giving your time and coming in this evening. Hope you've all been able to take away stuff from it. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you all very much. Good night.